5 times, the Blackfyres took up arms against the Iron Throne. 5 times, they failed. Yet the rebellions they fought shaped the realm for generations, poisoning courts, fracturing loyalties, and forcing the Targaryens to bleed for a crown they had held for nearly 2 centuries. It began with a sword, not a war, not a conspiracy, not a clash of armies. A sword placed in the hands of a king's bastard son while the true-born heir still lived. That act, whether born of affection, vanity, or something more deliberate, set forth a conflict that would not be fully extinguished for decades. The Blackfyre Rebellions are not simply the story of bastards who wanted a throne. They are the story of what happens when legitimacy fractures. When 2 sons of the same king look at the same crown and both believe, with reason, that it belongs to them. When the realm is forced to choose, and in choosing, it tears itself apart. This is the story of House Blackfyre, from the sword that made them, to the war that broke them, to the shadow they cast long after the last of their line was gone. Before Damon Blackfyre ever lifted a sword, before the first banner was raised or the first oath broken, there was a king on the Iron Throne. He was doing his quiet, relentless best to destroy everything his ancestors had built. His name was Aegon, the 4th of that name. His second title came later, and it stuck in the way that honest titles always do. Aegon the Unworthy. He earned it many times over. In his appetites, which were vast and unconcealed. In his cruelties, which were casual in the way that only men with no fear of consequence can manage. In his treatment of his queen, Nerys, a gentle woman of genuine piety, whom he humiliated publicly and repeatedly across the length of his reign. Her suffering was so visible that even men who owed him everything quietly looked away. He fathered children across the realm with a generosity he extended to no other part of his kingship. The count varies depending on which account you trust, but the number that matters is smaller. The ones he acknowledged, the ones he drew close and elevated and made into instruments of his vanity, the great bastards. Among them were some who had become significant in their own right. Brynden Rivers, pale as milk, born with a wine-red mark covering half his face in the shape of a raven. Aegon Rivers, hard and watchful, with a coldness that sat in the eyes before it ever reached the voice. Shera Seastar, whose beauty men spoke of in tones usually reserved for things they could not fully explain. And then there was Damon. Damon Waters was born in 170 AC to Prince Aegon, not yet king, and his cousin, Daena Targaryen. For years, she refused to name the father of her child. When the truth finally came out, it caused a major scandal. Under King Baelor the Blessed, a deeply pious ruler, the court had no tolerance for something like this. A bastard prince of such obvious royal blood was not something they were willing to accept. The scandal faded. Aegon IV eventually took the throne, and Damon grew. The problem was what Damon grew into. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the silver-gold hair and deep violet eyes of old Valyrian blood. He looked, in every particular, like the portraits of Aegon the Conqueror that hung in the halls of every great castle in Westeros. The resemblance was noted immediately and commented upon constantly, and it carried a weight that went beyond appearance. Men who looked at him saw something. Not merely an impressive young man, but a shape they recognized from legend. A figure their instincts told them belonged at the head of a column, or standing above a great hall, or sitting in a place of authority. He was 12 years old when the first definitive line was crossed. He had entered a squire's tourney and won it, This was not surprising to anyone who had watched him train, since his ability with a blade was already beyond what his age suggested. Still, it was the kind of public moment that demanded a public response. His father's response was the gift of Blackfyre. Blackfyre was not simply a sword, it was the sword, the ancestral Valyrian steel blade of House Targaryen, the weapon that had hung at the hip of every king since Aegon the Conqueror had first set foot on the shore of the Blackwater. It was called the Sword of Kings, not as flattery, but as description, a designation of what it was, what it meant, and who it was supposed to pass to. That sword was supposed to pass to Daeron, the true-born heir, the king's legitimate son, pale and scholarly, with his Dornish-looking features, his books, and his careful political mind. Aegon gave it to his bastard instead. The realm understood the gift as if written in a royal decree. Whether Aegon meant it as simple favoritism, as a deliberate statement about his feelings toward his heir, or as the pleasure of a grand gesture, the meaning was not subtle. Damon Waters understood. Daeron understood. Every lord and knight and maester who heard the news understood, and the understanding moved through the great houses of Westeros like a current beneath still water. The true-born heir had been passed over in the most visible, irrevocable way, short of a formal disinheritance. The man chosen in his place was an unlegitimized bastard with Valyrian steel in his hand and the face of a conqueror. Aegon IV did something else before the gift of the sword, though its full significance would only become clear later. He talked. He had spent years circulating a rumor about his own son's parentage. The whisper moved from court to court, from letter to letter, repeated in the way that useful rumors always are, half in jest, half in earnest, always with a veil of plausible denial. The rumor said that Daeron was not Aegon's son at all, that his mother, Nerys, the pious and gentle queen, had found comfort elsewhere, that the father was Aemon the Dragon Knight, the queen's own brother, a man famous enough and admirable enough that the slander had a particular sting to it. Aegon IV told this story about his own wife and his own son. Whether he believed it, or whether he simply found it useful, is one of those questions the records decline to settle. What is beyond doubt is that he repeated it. Once a king has said a thing, it does not die when he stops saying it. It finds other mouths, other ears, other lords nursing their own grievances who discover, in a convenient rumor, an ideological scaffolding for the thing they already wanted to do. Daeron Falspawn, they would call him later. The name came from his father's lips, originally. Then the reign ended. In 184 years after Aegon's conquest, Aegon IV Targaryen died. He left behind a document that would define the next century of Westerosi history more completely than any battle or any treaty. His final will. In it, he legitimized every bastard child he had ever fathered. All of them. In a single sweeping decree, Damon Waters and Brynden Rivers and Aegor Rivers and Shira Seastar and the rest were transformed, on paper, from bastards into lords of the realm. The new king, Daeron II, was advised not to honor the decree. Men whose judgment he trusted told him plainly that allowing it to stand was dangerous. It would transform a complicated private situation into an explosive public one, and the realm would be better served by setting the will aside. Daeron allowed it to stand. He was that kind of man. His father's word had been a royal decree, however recklessly given, and overturning it would have set a precedent that troubled him more than the threat itself. He had watched his father do damage for decades He did not want to begin his own reign by undermining the principle of royal authority, even when that authority had been exercised by a fool. It was a defensible position. It may also have been the most consequential decision of his reign. Daemon Waters took the name Damon Blackfyre after the sword his father had given him. He was granted lands along the Blackwater Rush and founded a house bearing the sword as its name and its sigil, a black three-headed dragon on red. This was the deliberate reverse of the Targaryen arms. Everything about House Blackfyre was designed as a reflection, a challenge, a question asked in heraldry rather than words. If that sword belongs to us, the sigil asked, why not the throne? For years the question sat unanswered. Daemon was granted lands and trained his men. He was admired, celebrated, spoken of with a reverence that the scholarly Daeron rarely inspired and could not manufacture. Great knights sought his company. Young lords measured themselves against his standard, and lords began to arrive at his door. They came from the Reach and the Stormlands first, the regions with the deepest roots of anti-Dornish feeling. Daeron II had done what no Targaryen before him had managed. He had brought Dorne formally into the realm through a double marriage alliance that tied the ancient enemies of the south into the royal family itself. For lords whose grandfathers had died on Dornish spears, this was not diplomacy. It was betrayal. The Dornish appeared at court. Dornish customs crept into the capital's habits. Daeron's heir, Baelor, looked Dornish in the way that men who resented Dorne noticed and remembered. And now there was a whisper that Daeron was not truly Aegon's son at all, that the whole arrangement had been plotted from the beginning by those who did not have the realm's true interests at heart. The lords who came to Daemon did not all come for the same reason. Some believed genuinely that Daemon had the stronger claim. Some resented the Dornish presence and needed a face to put on that resentment. Some were ambitious men who calculated that a new king would create new opportunities. Daemon seemed far more likely to reward early supporters than the comfortable king who already had everything arranged to his satisfaction. Some of them simply looked at Daemon and felt the thing that cannot be argued with, the instinct that this was the shape of a king and that the shape mattered. Many accounts describe Daemon as having been reluctant for a long time. He had been given a name, a house, lands, and the sword his father had pressed into his hands with such unmistakable significance. He was no exile, no dispossessed son nursing wounds in a foreign city. He had position, power, and the respect of men whose respect meant something. Beneath every honor, beneath every tournament victory, and every admiring lord who came to bend the knee in his hall, the word was still there. Waters, the name he had been born with. The name that said, outside the line, outside the blood, outside the right. The legitimization had changed the law. It had not changed what men whispered when they thought no one was listening. His half-brother Aegon Rivers understood this. Aegon, cold and precise, burning with an energy that had no clean outlet, pressed him, not once, but repeatedly, across years, with the particular urgency of a man who has decided what the right answer is. He could not understand why the person who needed to act had not yet acted. He argued the claim. He named the insult. He pointed at the sword that Daemon carried every day and asked what it meant, if not this. Eventually, Daemon listened. He was not the first man of genuine quality to be talked into a war he might have preferred to avoid. He would not be the last. But the sword was in his hand. The name was on his sigil, and the lords who had ridden to his door were still waiting for an answer. The rebellion that followed was not the inevitable consequence of one man's ambition. It was the long-delayed consequence of a king's recklessness, a man who had planted this in the soil of the realm and then gone into the ground himself, leaving everyone else to deal with what grew. Aegon the Unworthy had been in the earth for over a decade by the time the first sword cleared its scabbard in his son's name. But the war that came was his. Every death on the red grass field, every burning village, every widow and fatherless child in the Reach and the Stormlands and the Riverlands belonged to him. He never saw the fire he had started. He never paid for it. That bill fell to everyone else. The man history cannot stop turning over in its hands is not the one who wins. Winning is common enough, and winners write their own records in the dry language of administration and decree. The man history continues to analyze is the one who almost won, the one who came close enough that the outcome feels provisional even centuries later, as if the world that resulted from his defeat is still somehow on trial, still being measured against the world that might have been. Damon Blackfyre is that kind of man. He died face down in a field, with 7 arrows in him and his sons dead beside him, and the cause he had ridden for broken open beyond any immediate repair. By every clean measure of outcome, he lost. The red dragon held, the black dragon fell, and yet the war his death was supposed to end did not end. It resumed, and resumed again, and again after that. 4 more times across nearly a century, men picked up the black banner and carried it back toward a throne that a dead man had never quite reached. That persistence is its own kind of answer. Men do not fight and die for a generation, then 2 generations, then 3, in the name of a failure. They fight in the name of something that felt, to those who were present, like it should have succeeded, like the outcome was wrong in a way that demanded correction. To understand why so many felt that way, you have to understand Damon Blackfyre not as history eventually rendered him. Not the cautionary symbol, the rebel prince, the first black dragon. You have to understand what he was like to be near. By every surviving account, he was extraordinary to look at. This is noted so consistently across so many different sources that it stops being vanity and becomes simply a fact about the man, the way height or a particular skill is a fact. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of build that suggests power held in reserve rather than displayed. His hair was the silver gold of old Valyrian blood, worn long, and his eyes were a deep violet that contemporaries reached for comparisons to describe. He looked like what people had been told Targaryens should look like. More specifically, he looked like what people had been told Aegon the Conqueror had looked like. The portraits of the Conqueror that hung in halls across Westeros were old and had been copied and recopied until the original likeness had softened into something more archetype than portrait. They shared certain qualities, a certain shape of face and set of the jaw and quality of stillness. Damon matched them in a way that made men catch their breath when they first saw him. This is not a small thing in a world where legitimacy is partly a visual argument. Kings are supposed to look like kings. No one states this openly, because stated openly it sounds like foolishness. But it operates nonetheless, in every court and every hall where men assess a claimant and decide whether the assessment tips toward belief. Daeron II was a careful, intelligent, capable administrator who looked like what he was. A scholar's son, pale and measured, more comfortable in a scriptorium than on horseback. Damon Blackfyre looked like the dream. He could also fight. This bears more than a passing mention. because in the world of Westeros, the ability to fight is not merely a practical skill, it is a form of moral language. A king who can lead men in the field and hold his own against the best swords in the realm commands a kind of respect that no amount of good governance can fully substitute for. Damon excelled at it in a way that moved past excellence into something closer to legend, while he was still alive to hear about it. He had won his first significant tournament at 12. By the time he was grown, the tourney circuit had become, in significant part, a catalogue of his victories. He trained constantly and seriously, in the way that developed his skill so that it became something more reliable than talent. At the Battle of the Redgrass Field, the accounts converge on a picture that is almost impossible to credit if you have not already accepted that such men occasionally exist. He cut Lord Donald Arryn's vanguard apart. Will Waynwood died. The Knight of Standfast died. He moved through the Loyalist forces like something that had escaped the conditions constraining ordinary men. When Sir Gawain Corbray of the Kingsguard stepped forward to meet him, carrying Lady Forlorn, a Valyrian steel blade, Damon met him and won. He disarmed Corbray, left him blind and bleeding in the grass, and then he ordered the man carried to the maesters in the rear. He stopped in the middle of the most important battle of his life to make sure his fallen opponent received care. This detail sits in every account, and it tells you more about who he is remembered as being than any list of victories. It reads, depending on which side of the field you are standing on, as either nobility or a fatal miscalculation. It was likely both. The men who followed him did not follow him merely because he was impressive. Something else was at work in how he moved through the world. Something in the quality of his attention and the nature of his conduct made men feel, in his presence, that they were in the company of someone who operated by a different and more demanding code. The accounts describe a man who was kind to those who served him, who remembered names, who treated the knights and lords around him as if their dignity mattered. He is remembered as faithful to Rohan of Tyrosh and openly devoted to his children in ways the culture of his time would not have required him to display. How much of this is the man, and how much is the legend that formed around him afterward, is a question the sources do not settle. The pro-Blackfyre accounts have every reason to present him this way. So do men who followed him to a field and watched him die, and who spent the rest of their lives needing to believe the cause had been worth it. Some sources suggest he did not want the war. Damon is remembered as having been lobbied for years before he moved. The lords came to his door. Aegon Rivers argued. A whole network of men who had decided what the answer should be worked steadily at the task of convincing him to become the instrument of their conviction. No decree could give him the clean resolution of the question his existence posed. He was a legitimized bastard in a world that did not quite know what that meant. The legitimization had changed the law. It had not changed what men whispered when they thought no one was listening. His half-brother Aegon Rivers understood this about him before Damon fully understood it himself. Eventually, Damon accepted it. The moment of decision is not recorded cleanly anywhere. What the records show is a gradual shift, the lords coming more frequently, the preparations growing more visible. Then a raven reached King Daeron's court, with word that Damon meant to declare himself king within the turn of a moon. By then, it was already too late to stop it quietly. The Black Dragon was not simply a man anymore. It was a cause that had found its face, and the face was willing. The man history cannot stop turning over in its hands is not the one who wins. Winning is common enough, and winners write their own records in the dry language of administration and decree. The man history continues to analyze is the one who almost won, the one who came close enough that the outcome feels provisional even centuries later, as if the world that resulted from his defeat is still somehow on trial, still being measured against the world that might have been. Damon Blackfyre is that kind of man. He died face down in a field, with 7 arrows in him and his sons dead beside him, and the cause he had ridden for broken open beyond any immediate repair. By every clean measure of outcome, he lost. The red dragon held, the black dragon fell, and yet the war his death was supposed to end did not end. It resumed, and resumed again, and again after that. 4 more times across nearly a century, men picked up the black banner and carried it back toward a throne that a dead man had never quite reached. That persistence is its own kind of answer. Men do not fight and die for a generation, then 2 generations, then 3, in the name of a failure. They fight in the name of something that felt, to those who were present, like it should have succeeded, like the outcome was wrong in a way that demanded correction. To understand why so many felt that way, you have to understand Damon Blackfyre not as history eventually rendered him. Not the cautionary symbol, the rebel prince, the first black dragon. You have to understand what he was like to be near. By every surviving account, he was extraordinary to look at. This is noted so consistently across so many different sources that it stops being vanity and becomes simply a fact about the man, the way height or a particular skill is a fact. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of build that suggests power held in reserve rather than displayed. His hair was the silver gold of old Valyrian blood, worn long, and his eyes were a deep violet that contemporaries reached for comparisons to describe. He looked like what people had been told Targaryens should look like. More specifically, he looked like what people had been told Aegon the Conqueror had looked like. The portraits of the Conqueror that hung in halls across Westeros were old and had been copied and recopied until the original likeness had softened into something more archetype than portrait. They shared certain qualities, a certain shape of face and set of the jaw and quality of stillness. Damon matched them in a way that made men catch their breath when they first saw him. This is not a small thing in a world where legitimacy is partly a visual argument. Kings are supposed to look like kings. No one states this openly, because stated openly, it sounds like foolishness. But it operates nonetheless, in every court and every hall where men assess a claimant and decide whether the assessment tips toward belief. Daeron II was a careful, intelligent, capable administrator who looked like what he was. A scholar's son, pale and measured, more comfortable in a scriptorium than on horseback. Damon Blackfyre looked like the dream. He could also fight. This bears more than a passing mention, because in the world of Westeros the ability to fight is not merely a practical skill, it is a form of moral language. A king who can lead men in the field and hold his own against the best swords in the realm commands a kind of respect that no amount of good governance can fully substitute for. Damon excelled at it in a way that moved past excellence into something closer to legend, while he was still alive to hear about it. He had won his first significant tournament at 12. By the time he was grown, the tourney circuit had become, in significant part, a catalogue of his victories. He trained constantly and seriously, in the way that developed his skill so that it became something more reliable than talent. At the Battle of the Redgrass Field, The accounts converge on a picture that is almost impossible to credit if you have not already accepted that such men occasionally exist. He cut Lord Donald Arryn's vanguard apart. Will Waynwood died. The Knight of Standfast died. He moved through the Loyalist forces like something that had escaped the conditions constraining ordinary men. When Sir Gawain Corbray of the Kingsguard stepped forward to meet him, carrying Lady Forlorn, a Valyrian steel blade, Damon met him and won. He disarmed Corbray, left him blind and bleeding in the grass, and then he ordered the man carried to the maesters in the rear. He stopped in the middle of the most important battle of his life to make sure his fallen opponent received care. This detail sits in every account, and it tells you more about who he is remembered as being than any list of victories. It reads, depending on which side of the field you are standing on, as either nobility or a fatal miscalculation. It was likely both. The men who followed him did not follow him merely because he was impressive. Something else was at work in how he moved through the world. Something in the quality of his attention and the nature of his conduct made men feel, in his presence, that they were in the company of someone who operated by a different and more demanding code. The accounts describe a man who was kind to those who served him, who remembered names, who treated the knights and lords around him as if their dignity mattered. He is remembered as faithful to Rohan of Tyrosh, and openly devoted to his children in ways the culture of his time would not have required him to display. How much of this is the man, and how much is the legend that formed around him afterward, is a question the sources do not settle. The pro-Blackfyre accounts have every reason to present him this way. So do men who followed him to a field and watched him die, and who spent the rest of their lives needing to believe the cause had been worth it. Some sources suggest he did not want the war. Damon is remembered as having been lobbied for years before he moved. The lords came to his door. Aegon Rivers argued. A whole network of men who had decided what the answer should be worked steadily at the task of convincing him to become the instrument of their conviction. No decree could give him the clean resolution of the question his existence posed. He was a legitimized bastard in a world that did not quite know what that meant. The legitimization had changed the law. It had not changed what men whispered when they thought no one was listening. His half-brother Aegon Rivers understood this about him before Damon fully understood it himself. Eventually, Damon accepted it. The moment of decision is not recorded cleanly anywhere. What the records show is a gradual shift, the lords coming more frequently, the preparations growing more visible. Then a raven reached King Daeron's court, with word that Damon meant to declare himself king within the turn of a moon. By then, it was already too late to stop it quietly. The Black Dragon was not simply a man anymore. It was a cause that had found its face, and the face was willing. A kingdom does not split the way a bone splits, cleanly, at a single point of impact, the fracture line obvious in retrospect. It splits the way old wood splits, slowly, along grain lines that were already there, following the natural geography of grievance and ambition, and old wounds that never fully closed. By the time the crack is visible, the separation has already been happening for years in the dark interior of the thing. The first Blackfyre Rebellion looked, from the outside, like a sudden rupture. A rebel prince raising a black banner, lords declaring for one side or the other, armies marching toward a field where the question would be settled. But the rupture had been building since before Damon was born. The Reach and the Stormlands were the heartland of Blackfyre support, and the reason for this was not primarily about Damon. It was about the Dornish. Dorne and the Reach had been in a continuous conflict for centuries. The Dornish marches, that stretch of contested land along the border between the two regions, had been fought over so many times that the lords there had stopped thinking of peace as a natural condition and started thinking of it as an intermission. Dornish men had burned Reach villages. Reach lords had burned Dornish ones. Men on both sides had watched fathers and brothers die in border conflicts that had no resolution, only succession. Then Daemon II married a Dornish princess, and he gave his sister Daenerys to the Prince of Dorne. Dornish lords appeared at court in King's Landing, walking the same halls as the men whose grandfathers had died fighting their grandfathers. They spoke a different way, dressed a different way, and observed customs that the great houses of the Reach and Stormlands had spent generations being told were the customs of enemies. The political logic of the arrangement was sound. Daeron had achieved what no Targaryen before him had managed, the peaceful integration of the last independent kingdom into the realm. Measured against the centuries of war it replaced, it was a genuine triumph. The lords who resented it did not measure it that way. They saw their king choosing his enemies over his allies, elevating the people who had burned their villages and killed their kin into positions of favor and proximity to the throne. Daemon did not cause this resentment. He simply existed at the moment it needed somewhere to go. The rumor about Daeron's parentage found its most willing audience in exactly these regions. In a house in the Reach already disposed to dislike the king who had brought Dornishmen to court, the whisper that Daeron was not Aegon IV's son landed differently than it did in the Vale or the North. In the North, the rumor was assessed as a rumor. In the Reach, it had the quality of confirmation. It fit the shape of a suspicion that was already there. Daeron Falseborn. The name circulated through the halls of Highgarden and the border castles of the Stormlands with a persistence that mere political disagreement does not usually generate. It allowed the men who resented the Dornish peace to frame their resentment, not as wounded pride, but as principle. They were not simply angry at change. They were defending the rightful line against a pretender. Men will do far more in the name of principle than they will do in the name of feeling. Give a grievance a theory, and it becomes a cause. The Blackfyre cause was, in significant part, the Dornish resentment dressed in the language of dynastic legitimacy. Among the great houses, the formal picture was lopsided. Houses Arryn, Tyrell, Tully, and Martell all backed the crown. The Tyrells owed their seat to House Targaryen in the most direct possible way, having been stewards of Highgarden before the conquest, and elevated to lordship when the Gardener line ended at the Field of Fire. The Martells had everything to gain from Daeron's rule, and nothing from a Blackfyre victory. The Arryns assessed and chose the crown. The Tullys backed the side most likely to win. None of this meant that every lord in these houses was a cheerful loyalist. Significant numbers of Reach lords and fighting men ended up on the Blackfyre side despite Tyrell loyalty, the family umbrella failing to cover the whole of its domain. The propaganda war that preceded the actual fighting was, in some respects, more interesting than the fighting itself. Daemon's appearance was its own argument, requiring no herald to make it. The sword functioned as propaganda in the most literal sense, recognizable to every lord in Westeros, a daily visible claim that required no words. He also minted coins. The coins had little practical value, but they circulated through markets and hands and purses across the realm, carrying a face and a symbol into places that ravens and heralds never reached. The attempted theft of dragon eggs followed the same logic. A Blackfyre dragon would not just be a weapon, but an argument. One no counter-propaganda could easily answer. Opposing them was Brynden Rivers, known as Bloodraven, the king's spymaster. Some called him a sorcerer, others called him a kinslayer. He had built an intelligence network with extraordinary reach. 1,000 eyes and one, men said of him. His agents did not fight for the crown. They removed threats before they could act. The loyalist case was simpler and far more dangerous. Legitimacy by birth. If a bastard, no matter how capable or favoured, could replace a true-born heir, then the rule that upheld every lord's inheritance was no longer secure. And if that rule failed, the realm would not just fracture at the top, it would unravel everywhere. If this can happen to a king, the argument asked quietly, where does it stop? For many lords who might otherwise have been drawn by Daemon's glamour, that question was sufficient. The line between the factions was not a line between the good and the bad. It was a line between different readings of a genuinely ambiguous situation, different weightings of competing loyalties, different calculations about risk and reward. Some lords, in the manner of lords throughout history, waited. They kept their armies close to home and their opinions even closer. They waited for the shape of the conflict to become clear enough that the choice between sides became the choice between the winner and the loser. The realm stood on the edge of itself for months before the swords came out. Ravens flew, lords were visited, promises were made and contingencies discussed. Men who had not ridden to war in years began inventorying their armories with the quiet, methodical attention of people who are trying not to admit to themselves what they are preparing for. Word reached Daeron II that Damon meant to declare within the turn of a moon. He sent the Kingsguard to make an arrest. Damon was warned before they arrived and managed to avoid capture. The black banner went up, and the realm that had been splitting along its grain lines for years finally came apart in the open, where everyone could see it. War in Westeros followed a logic that every great lord understood before he could ride. Armies moved along rivers and roads. Supply lines determined how long a force could stay in the field. Castles anchored regions. Their garrisons controlled the surrounding land and the roads that ran through it. The first Blackfyre Rebellion was fought in that language. What set it apart was not the nature of the fighting, but the scale of commitment on both sides, and the quality of the men carrying it forward. It lasted roughly a year. In that time, it spread across more of the continent than almost any conflict since the Dance of the Dragons. Damon Blackfyre escaped arrest in the dark. The exact route is not preserved. What is known is that Sir Quinton Ball was there. Fireball, as men called him, for his temper, which was volcanic and quick, but also for the quality of his energy in the field. He burned through opposition before it had time to understand what was bearing down on it. He was the master at arms of the Red Keep, the man who had trained alongside Damon. He understood better than almost anyone what Damon was capable of and what it would mean on a battlefield. He got Damon out. That single act was the rebellion's first military contribution. Without it, the arrest would have succeeded. The rebellion would have been strangled before it had a name, and the next century of Westerosi history would have taken a different shape entirely. Fireball took command of the Western campaign for the Blackfyre cause. He marched hard into the Westerlands and struck before the Loyalists could fully assemble. At Lannisport, he killed Lord Lefford, a bannerman of House Lannister. It was the first clear signal that the West was now in the war. A Lannister force soon answered, led by Damon Lannister himself, fighting for the crown. Fireball met it in the field and broke it as well. The western flank of the Loyalist position had come apart in a matter of weeks. The campaign moved south from there. At the crossing of the Manda, Fireball found the sons of House Penrose, who had taken up arms for the crown. He killed them, all save the youngest. The youngest he spared as a personal favour to their mother. He sent word to Lady Penrose that her youngest son would not be harmed. This is not a detail that strategic accounts pause over, but it reveals the texture of what Fireball was, beneath the reputation for explosive violence and the trail of decisive victories. He had a code. It was personal rather than chivalric, but it was real, and he applied it even in the middle of a campaign that was consuming everything around it. In the Reach, the picture was more complicated. Lord Leo Tyrell fought for the crown, and fought well, as a capable commander who understood the landscape of his own region. He used that understanding to contest the Blackfyre advance with a tenacity that prevented the rebellion from consolidating the south as cleanly as its early momentum suggested. The fighting in the Reach had a grinding quality that the Western campaign did not. The overall picture through the first months was one of a rebellion that was winning in the West, struggling in the Reach, and managing something closer to a draw in the Riverlands. In King's Landing, Daeron made a change. His hand, Lord Ambrose Butterwell, had begun to seem unreliable. Whether through hesitation or divided loyalties, he was not a man the king trusted in a war. He was removed and replaced with Lord Hayford, whose loyalty was not in doubt. The war moved toward autumn, with neither side having achieved the kind of decisive advantage that would force the other's hand. On the eve of what the combatants did not yet know would be the final engagement, two things worked against the Black Dragon. The first was absence. Lord Bracken, fighting for the Blackfyre cause, had crossed the narrow sea to hire reinforcements. Crossbowmen from Myr, professional soldiers who might have changed the balance of the final battle. Storms delayed the ships. They were still at sea when the fighting began. Bracken had done everything correctly. The sea did what the sea does. Those men never arrived. The second was simpler and more final. Sir Quinton Ball, Fireball, stopped on the road to drink water. An archer saw him. The arrow found him in the chance way that arrows find men who are not expecting them. Not in a charge or a siege or any situation that a man of his quality would have managed. It found him in the ordinary, unguarded moment of a man doing something as human and unremarkable as drinking. He fell. The night before the decisive battle of the first Blackfyre Rebellion, the Black Dragon lost the man who had done more than any other to give the rebellion its credibility and its momentum. Not to a better warrior, not to an ambush or a conspiracy, to a random arrow from an unknown hand. The army learned of it that night. They would fight anyway. The forces were assembled, the ground was chosen, and the morning was coming regardless of what it would cost. But they would fight without Fireball. The rebellion had fought itself to the edge of a single engagement. Everything that came before had narrowed to this. One field, one morning. Two sides that had spent a year in motion now facing each other across open ground, with the sky above and no more room to maneuver. The dry grass moved in the wind. Above the Blackfyre lines, the Black Dragon standard lifted and fell with it. Damon Blackfyre rode to the front of his army with the Sword of Kings at his side and his sons alive beside him. He did not know yet what the mourning would cost. No one did. The grass was dry. This is the detail that the accounts return to, almost without meaning to, as if the men who were there understood, even in the middle of it, that the ground itself was part of what happened. A dry field carries fire. It moves fast and in every direction at once, and it does not distinguish between the men it takes. The red grass field would be named for what it looked like afterward. Before that, it was simply open ground between Golden Grove and Stonebridge, wide and flat, the kind of terrain that gave cavalry room to build momentum and archers clear lines of sight. It gave no one any particular advantage in the matter of cover or elevation, except for the Weeping Ridge. The Weeping Ridge sat above the field to one side, a rise of ground modest enough that its significance was not immediately obvious. It was simply higher than what surrounded it. High enough, it would prove, for everything. The armies took their positions. The Blackfyre host arrayed itself with Lord Costain holding the left flank and Lord Shawnee on the right. Aegon Rivers, Bittersteel, stood with the main body, his presence a kind of assurance to the men around him that the cause still had its hardest instrument available. Damon rode at the front. On the Loyalist side, the Arryn vanguard took the forward position under Lord Donald Arryn. Bloodraven held back with the Raven's teeth. 300 archers of exceptional skill and discipline, kept in reserve, close, ready, waiting for the moment when their particular quality would matter most. The battle opened with the conventional movement of forces that have spent weeks working toward a confrontation and are now simply closing the remaining distance. The Arryn vanguard pushed forward. Damon met them. Lord Donald Arryn's carefully ordered formation encountered something their training had not prepared them for. The vanguard, which had been an organized military unit, became something less organized. The coherence bled out of it as the man with the black dragon sword worked through them. He left no stable point for the formation to anchor itself around. Damon was not fighting carelessly. He was precise, reading the battle as he fought inside it. He was making up in personal effectiveness for the command quality that had been lost on a road the night before to an unnamed archer. By the consensus of those who watched it, the performance was extraordinary. And then Sir Gawain Corbray stepped forward. Corbray was Kingsguard. He carried Lady Forlorn, a Valyrian steel blade that had been in his family's hands for generations. He stepped into the space that Damon was occupying and raised the blade. Valyrian steel against Valyrian steel. Blackfyre against Lady Forlorn. The duel that followed became, in the telling of those who survived to tell it, a condensation of everything the larger struggle meant. It was pressed into a single exchange between two men. Damon won. Corbray went down. He was blinded and bleeding in the grass. The Valyrian blade still in his hand, but the hand unable to use it anymore. Damon looked at the man bleeding at his feet. He called for a maester, waved the rear attendants forward, and waited long enough to confirm that Corbray would be carried back from the fighting. He would not be left to bleed out in the press of combat. On the Weeping Ridge, Brynden Rivers had been watching. Bloodraven had not committed his raven's teeth to the main fighting. He had held them through the opening exchanges, watching the battle with the cold attention of a man who has decided what he is looking for and is waiting for it to appear. He found Damon's banner. The calculation Bloodraven made in the next few moments is one that history has argued over ever since. He did not challenge Damon on the open field. He did not walk down from the ridge and meet him face to face. He made arithmetic. If Damon dies, the battle ends. If the battle ends, the war ends. He looked at the men around the banner and found Aegon, Damon's elder twin son, fighting beside his father. He killed Aegon first. This was not an accident. The Raven's teeth were not ordinary archers, and Bloodraven was not directing them at the mass of the opposing force. He selected Aegon deliberately, understanding what the selection would do. Damon would not leave his son. This was not a guess. It was a reading of the man. Bloodraven looked at Damon's character and used it as a weapon against him. He was right. Damon saw his son fall. He stopped. The momentum that had been building through the Arryn vanguard simply ceased. It was replaced by the older and more absolute imperative of a father who has watched his child take an arrow. The Raven's teeth had his position now clear and still. 6 more arrows. The last one killed him. Blackfyre fell into the grass, and the black dragon standard wavered above the man who had been carrying the whole weight of the cause in his body. Then the standard was simply marking where he had been, rather than where he was going. Damon's younger twin, Aemon, reached his father. He picked up Blackfyre. This is a gesture that says everything about what the red grass field was to the men who fought on the Black Dragon's side. It was not simply a military engagement, but a cause that ran beneath the military logic. It was something personal enough that a boy would pick up the sword and try to continue what he had not yet understood was already over. Bloodraven's arrows found him too. Both sons dead, the father dead, the sword of kings in the grass. Bittersteel launched his charge. Aegon Rivers, watching from the main body and seeing the 3 deaths and the banner failing, did the thing that Aegon Rivers did. He attacked. He drove forward into the chaos with Blackfyre in his hand, retrieved from where it had fallen, and found Bloodraven. The duel between Bittersteel and Bloodraven is the second great single combat of the Redgrass Field. 2 half-brothers, 2 great bastards of the same reckless father, on opposite sides of a war that their father had made possible, meeting in the middle of the catastrophe with blades drawn. Bittersteel took Bloodraven's eye. Bloodraven survived. Bittersteel fled, but not empty-handed. He took Blackfyre with him. The sword did not fall into loyalist hands. It went east, into the keeping of the man who had decided that the cause would survive the field, regardless of what the field had taken. The final blow came from 2 directions. Prince Baelor Breakspear arrived with a host of Stormlanders and Dornishmen, the ancient enemies of the southern marches moving in the same direction under the same banner. They fell on the rebel rear. At the same moment, Prince Maekar Targaryen had gathered the fragments of the shattered Arryn vanguard. He organized them into an anvil at the position the vanguard had once held. Between the hammer and the anvil, what remained of the Blackfyre army was destroyed. 10,000 men dead. The Redgrass Field keeps posing a question that does not resolve cleanly into a verdict. Bloodraven won the battle. The tactics were sound. The reading of Damon's character was accurate. The decision to take the high ground and use it at the moment of maximum effect was the kind of military thinking that wins battles. But the manner of the winning, the arrow into Aegon, the deliberate use of a father's love as the mechanism of the father's death, left a residue that did not wash off. The approach was not dishonorable in any technical sense. And yet, the men who had followed Damon to that field remembered it as the day he was killed from a ridge while kneeling over his son. That memory was not nothing. A cause that loses cleanly stays lost. A cause that loses the way Damon lost, to an arrow loosed by a half-brother on a ridge at the one moment in the battle when the field might have opened, does not stay lost the same way. It becomes a question, and questions, unlike defeats, do not have endings. Victory has its own kind of aftermath. Not the clean aftermath of the histories, the listing of terms, the accounting of the dead, the formal ceremonies of submission. The real aftermath is slower and less legible than that. It lives in the decisions made in the weeks and months after the fighting stops, when the king must decide what kind of victor he intends to be. Those decisions do not end wars. Sometimes they simply determine the shape of the next one. Daemon II sat with his victory and made his choices, and the choices were harder than his reputation for scholarly gentleness suggested he was capable of making. He had watched half the realm take up arms against him. He was not, afterward, in the mood for easy mercy. The punishment came in the form that punishment in Westeros most reliably takes. Land. Castles were forfeit. Titles were stripped or reduced. The landscape of lordship in the Reach and the Stormlands was redrawn along lines that reflected not the old inheritance of the houses involved, but the fresh arithmetic of who had chosen correctly and who had not. Hostages followed. Sons and heirs and younger brothers were taken to King's Landing and installed in the Red Keep, with the comfortable accommodations and the gentle captivity that the custom required. They were fed well, treated courteously, and present always as the unstated argument for their families' continued good behavior. The house that felt the punishment most completely was House Peak. The Peaks had backed the Black Dragon with a commitment that went beyond the hedged enthusiasm of houses who were keeping their options open. They lost 2 of their 3 castles, not all 3, which would have been annihilation. 2 of 3 was the calibrated punishment of a king who understood that the goal was not destruction, but correction. He may have miscalculated the depth of the wound. 2 of 3 castles was not enough to break the Peaks. It was enough to break something in them. Enough to build resentment on. Enough to pass down through generations as the story of what had been done to them. It carried the weight of why it had been done, and what it would mean if a black dragon ever flew again. Lord Gorman Peak, who would eventually organize the conspiracy at White Walls a generation later, was the product of that wound. He had not lost the castles himself. He had inherited the loss, and the loss had been given a name and a cause and a face long before he was old enough to understand what any of it meant. Punishments breed future rebellions not through excessive harshness, but through insufficient finality. Daeron had damaged the Peaks enough to make them dangerous, and not enough to make them harmless. The seeds were in the ground before the red grass field had finished cooling. The surviving Blackfyres went east. Daemon's wife Rohan was from Tyrosh, and it was to Tyrosh that she took what remained of her family. Among those who made that crossing were the sons who had survived the field, Daemon the Younger, Haegon, and Ennis, alongside Aegon Rivers himself. Bittersteel carried Blackfyre. The sword went east into the keeping of the hardest man on either side of the war. He arrived in Tyrosh with the children of his dead half-brother, with the sword that was supposed to be on a throne in King's Landing. He had a purpose so clear and so complete that it functioned less like ambition and more like weather. He would put a Blackfyre on the Iron Throne, not as a hope, as a fact waiting for its moment. Bittersteel needed soldiers who would serve the cause reliably, who would not be bought away by the higher fees that other employers could offer, and who would maintain their discipline across the years and decades that might be required. He built it from the community of exiles already around him, the Westerosi lords and knights who had backed the Black Dragon and lost everything. He named it the Golden Company. The Golden Company never breaks a contract. This became the institution's defining reputation, and also, quietly, an ideological statement. The great bastards and their descendants were men who had been failed by broken promises. Daemon II ruled for years after the Redgrass Field, and by most measurements, they were good ones. The realm settled. The hostages kept the rebel houses compliant. Then came 2 blows in quick succession. Prince Baelor Breakspear died at Ashford, not from illness, but from wounds sustained at a trial of 7. The heir who had arrived at the Redgrass Field at exactly the right moment and closed the battle died on a tawny ground instead, his skull crushed by his own brother. His son survived him, but only for a time. The Great Spring Sickness, which swept the realm in the years that followed, took Baelor's heirs, along with some of the hostages being held in the Red Keep. His death had left the succession less settled than it had been. The deaths of the young hostages left the leverage less complete. The small threads that Daeron had woven into the fabric of the realm's compliance began, here and there, to loosen. Not dramatically, not immediately, the realm held, but across the narrow sea, Bittersteel was watching. He had the patience of a man with a clear purpose and no competing obligations. He had the sword and the sons of the Black Dragon growing up in exile, with the full weight of their father's legend pressing on their shoulders. He had time. He was prepared to use all of it. The second Blackfyre Rebellion was meant to begin and end in a single day, at a wedding. Before the Crown could react, Gorman Peak had learned from the first attempt. The first had been too open, too visible, and had given the Crown time to prepare and Bloodraven time to watch. The second attempt would not give anyone that kind of time. It would happen in a day, at a wedding, before the ravens could fly and the armies could form, or so the plan required. Gorman Peak longed for the return of his family's castles. He understood that the Crown would not return the castles without a reason. The only reason that would suffice was a king who owed him something. A Blackfyre king, restored to the Iron Throne with Peak support, would owe him the castles and more. He needed a claimant. He found one across the narrow sea. Damon II Blackfyre was the third son of Damon I, a child survivor of the Redgrass Field, who had grown up in exile with the legend of his father pressing down on everything he was expected to become. He was quiet and inward, where his father had been broad and commanding. He had dragon dreams, the specific prophetic visions that ran in Targaryen blood, vivid enough to feel less like sleep and more like instruction. He had dreamed of his brothers dying in the field. He woke from those dreams and knew, with the certainty that dragon dreams carry, that what he had seen was not imagination. He dreamed of White Walls. He dreamed that a dragon would hatch there, a living dragon, born from one of the eggs scattered across the realm since the last of the great beasts had died. A living dragon in Blackfyre hands would not merely strengthen the claim, it would transform it. Gorman Peak built the conspiracy around that dream. Lord Ambrose Butterwell was getting married. The wedding of a Butterwell lord to a daughter of House Frey was the kind of event that lords attended not because they had particular interest in the marriage, but because tourneys were where the business of lordship happened. It was the perfect occasion for men with other business to gather without appearing to gather. The dragon egg was named as the tourney prize. Peak reached out to the scattered community of former Blackfyre sympathizers, gauged their interest, and built a guest list that was, beneath the surface, a muster. Damon crossed the narrow sea in disguise. He called himself Sir John the Fiddler, a hedge knight of no particular history, arrived from the wandering roads, seeking his fortune in the lists with the cheerful anonymity of a man who has nothing to recommend him but his skill. He was also, by all accounts, genuinely charming. He told Sir Duncan the Tall, a hedge knight who had arrived at the tourney through the ordinary mechanisms of a man looking for a purse, that he had dreamed of him wearing a white cloak, the Kingsguard's cloak, a dream of the future, stated plainly to a man he had only just met, with the calm certainty of someone reporting a fact rather than expressing a wish. That detail would prove accurate. The plan began to unravel through Sir Glendon Flowers. Glendon was a young knight of uncertain birth, a bastard, as his name declared, who was simply at the tourney because tourneys were where men of his position attempted to make their reputations. He was not part of the conspiracy. He was also, as it turned out, extremely good with a lance. The conspiracy required certain men to win and certain men to lose in a specific sequence. Glendon Flowers had not been approached, and he refused the approach when it finally came. He refused with the particular stubbornness of a man whose sense of himself was entirely invested in the legitimacy of his fighting ability. He kept winning. He won through the rounds that were supposed to have been managed before he reached them. Then the dragon egg disappeared. The explanation produced that Glendon Flowers had stolen it was the kind of explanation that smells like what it is. Duncan the Tall investigated, found the man responsible, a knight of Butterwell's household known as Sir Toad, fought him in single combat, and killed him. He revealed that the egg found in Glendon's saddlebags was a painted stone. The real egg was still missing. The architecture of the plan had been built around an egg that was now simply gone. Damon II revealed himself. He walked out of the fiction of Sir John the Fiddler and stood in his own name among the assembled lords. Instead of a hatching dragon and a completed coup, they had a young man declaring himself in front of men who had not yet committed. The plan had just been publicly unravelled by a hedge knight with no name. He ordered a trial by combat for Glendon Flowers. Glendon unhorsed him on the first pass. The man who was supposed to be king, the claimant whose dream of a hatching dragon had structured the entire conspiracy, was knocked from his horse in the first exchange. He was bested by the inconvenient bastard knight, whose refusal to lose a joust had started the unravelling. Bloodraven arrived before anyone had finished processing what had just happened. 3 Kingsguard, 300 Raven's Teeth, 500 knights, 5,000 infantry. He had known. Damon II looked at the forces assembled against him and made his calculation. He walked out of the White Wall's gates personally and surrendered to Bloodraven's forces. Gorman Peak was executed. Lord Butterwell lost White Walls, which was razed. Damon II was taken to King's Landing, where he died in captivity a few years later, having never fought a battle. Bittersteel had stayed away from all of it. He had not come for the White Walls conspiracy. He had watched from Essos with the cold assessment of a man who had decided the plan was inadequate before it began. More significantly, he had not given Damon II Blackfyre. Blackfyre remained in his keeping. The Sword of Kings, the symbol that was supposed to rest in the hand of the legitimate claimant, was absent from the claimant's hands. It was a judgment that this attempt did not deserve the sword, that the sword was too important to commit to a plan he did not trust. The sword sat in exile and waited, like its keeper, like the cause itself, diminished, but with fight, left in it still. Brynden Rivers had been running the realm for years before he was named Hand of the King. King Aerys I made it official. The title changed. The reality did not. Aerys was not a governing king. He preferred books to the mundane responsibility of ruling a kingdom, and left the work of the realm to others. It was Bloodraven who governed. He governed with the efficiency of a man who had watched the machinery of the realm long enough to understand where each gear sat and what it turned. He understood the great lords, their interests, and their grievances with the intimacy that only sustained surveillance produces. He understood Bittersteel, not simply what Aegon Rivers was doing, but how he thought. The cold logic, the patience, the absolute commitment to a single purpose had made Bittersteel the most durable enemy the dynasty had ever faced. The realm knew it was being watched. This knowledge does not sit comfortably. A specific quality of unease comes from understanding that information shared in private company may not remain private. The conversations held in your own hall might be reported to a man in King's Landing who had made comprehensive surveillance his instrument of governance. Bloodraven's network was not secret in its existence. Everyone understood that he had eyes. What no one knew was which eyes were his. The steward who refilled your cup at dinner, the maester who carried your ravens, the merchant who came through your gates on a regular schedule. Watching everyone was unnecessary. Making everyone believe they might be watched was enough. That belief changed behavior before any actual surveillance was required. Bloodraven understood that the fear of observation was more powerful than observation itself. He cultivated the uncertainty deliberately. The lords resented it. The Great Spring sickness came and went. It took some of the hostages from the Red Keep, the ones whose families had backed the Black Dragon. Their presence in the capital had been the structural guarantee of continued loyalty. One of the primary barriers between the exile community's ambitions and the actual business of raising a rebellion had been weakened. Damon II died in captivity. Aegon Blackfyre, the fourth son of Damon I, was now the primary claimant. Bittersteel had waited out the obstacle with the patience his whole career demonstrated was his most reliable quality. He began to move. The Third Rebellion launched in 219 years after Aegon's conquest. Bittersteel came himself. Aegon had the sword. The Golden Company crossed the narrow sea with the disciplined efficiency of an institution preparing for exactly this moment for the better part of 30 years. The rebellion was crushed. Prince Maekar Targaryen was the preeminent loyalist military figure, his sons riding alongside him. Aegon surrendered when the position became untenable. He understood that continuing would cost his soldiers their lives for an outcome no longer achievable. He laid down his arms. He knelt. And then they killed him. Not in the battle. After the surrender. After the laying down of arms. After the kneel that military honor required, and that military honor was supposed to protect. Someone killed Aegon Blackfyre after he had yielded. The accounts are not precise about who gave the order. The precise mechanics have the quality that certain acts acquire when no one involved wants their name attached to them. What is clear is the act itself, and the understanding among everyone present of what it meant. He had surrendered honorably. He was killed anyway. The loyalist lords, who had no Blackfyre sympathy, found the killing distasteful and said so carefully. They spoke in the way that men with no power to change an outcome express their judgment of it. The exile community across the narrow sea received it as confirmation of everything they had been telling themselves about the crown they opposed. You could not surrender to these people. Whether that was the intended lesson or simply the received one, it changed something about the calculations of men who might face the same choice in future conflicts. Bittersteel was captured. The decision about what to do with him was one of the more consequential failures of the reign. Aegon Rivers was the engine of the entire Blackfyre project. The Blackfyre claimants were symbols. Bittersteel was the mechanism. Killing the mechanism would have ended it. Maekar Targaryen understood this. Bloodraven understood it with particular clarity. King Aerys I did not execute him. The king, who had spent his reign disengaged from governance, arrived at the moment requiring the most decisive act of his reign, and chose the path that cost least in the immediate term. Sending Bittersteel to the wall looked decisive without requiring decision. It was the postponement of a problem dressed as its solution. Bittersteel's ship was intercepted in the narrow sea before it reached the wall. Blackfyre allies had been watching for it. He was freed, and he was back in Essos before the year was out. Blackfyre was in his hand. The Golden Company stood ready behind him. A new Blackfyre waited to be crowned. Bloodraven had won the Third Rebellion. He had lost the prisoner who made the victory mean something lasting. The realm continued in the same key it had always occupied under Aerys I. The king was present in name and absent in everything governance actually required. Bloodraven governed. He governed well by the narrow measure of keeping the realm intact. He governed badly by the broader measure of what governance is supposed to accomplish beyond mere continuity. The realm did not flourish. It merely continued. Beneath the surface, discontent at Bloodraven's methods was beginning to bubble. Quietly, in the way that wood rots from the inside before the surface shows it. And so, the stage was set for the Fourth Rebellion. Time does something to causes that fire cannot. Fire is immediate. Time works differently. Time blurs the specific into the general. It takes the faces of the dead and softens them into symbols. It takes the precise, felt injustice of a particular morning and converts it, slowly, into the inherited grievance of people who were not present. They carry the wound as a story rather than a scar. By 233 years after Aegon's conquest, the first Blackfyre Rebellion was history. Damon I had been dead for 36 years. What remained was the story of the field, passed down through the households of the exile community and the diminished rebel houses of the Reach and the Stormlands. The Great Council assembled to settle the succession after Aerys I died without a direct heir. Aenys Blackfyre wrote to Bloodraven. He was the fifth son of Damon I, the last of that man's sons still living in exile, and he had a claim. He understood that presenting that claim through armed rebellion had been tried 3 times without success. The Great Council was a different kind of opening, a legitimate forum, a recognized process. A claimant might advance his position through the machinery of the realm's own conventions. He asked for safe conduct to King's Landing. Bloodraven granted it. Aenys Blackfyre crossed the narrow sea on the strength of that promise, arrived in King's Landing, and was seized. He was dragged in fetters to the Red Keep. He was beheaded. His head was presented to the assembled lords of the Great Council. The promise of safe conduct was one of the oldest and most essential conventions of the realm's political culture. Without it, the very idea of a Great Council lost its meaning. A council that could invite claimants and execute them on arrival was not a forum for settling succession. It was a mechanism for eliminating rivals dressed as a forum. The assembled lords understood this. Even those with no sympathy for the Blackfyre cause understood that the promise had been given. The giving had created an obligation, and the obligation had been violated. Bloodraven heard it. His response was that of a man who has made a calculation and is comfortable with it. Aegon Blackfyre was dead. The cost was the specific, lasting damage that broken promises do to the authority of the person who breaks them. That damage compounds rather than fading. Every future promise given will be questioned and not fully trusted. The exile community received the news with the fury of confirmation. Aegon's death after surrender had been evidence. Aegon Blackfyre's execution under safe conduct was evidence of a sharper kind. It was the cold, deliberate, official act of a hand who had extended a formal guarantee and then discarded that promise with ruthless carelessness. The Golden Company heard it. The men who had joined because their fathers had lost lands or their grandfathers had backed the Black Dragon received the news as additional proof. Returning to Westeros on any terms the Crown offered was not a viable alternative to returning on the company's own terms. Bittersteel turned this news into proof that their cause still mattered and still required a king. He had Damon III, Aegon's son, crowned with the specific ceremony the Golden Company maintained for the purpose. The continuity of the cause was made physical in a coronation that no one outside the exile community would recognize. The exile community invested it with all the significance such ceremonies require. The Fourth Rebellion launched in 236 years after Aegon's conquest. Damon III Blackfyre crossed the narrow sea with the Golden Company and landed at Massey's Hook, close enough to King's Landing that the landing itself was a provocation. The strategy relied on an assumption that the three preceding rebellions had also relied on, with varying degrees of justification. The assumption was that Westerosi lords were waiting, that somewhere in the Reach and the Stormlands there were men who needed only the demonstration that the cause had arrived with sufficient force. That assumption had held some truth in prior rebellions. In this attempt, it was tested again, and the response showed how much had changed. The lords did not come. Damon III was not his grandfather. He had not earned his own reputation on any field. He had not been seen by the lords of the Reach and the Stormlands and assessed in the direct physical way that assessments of military leaders require. He was a symbol of a claim, and the claim was old. The lords looked at the Golden Company's banners on the shores of Massey's Hook and saw something their grandfathers had not seen when they looked at Damon I's banners. They saw foreigners. King Aegon V rode out personally. He came with his sons, and the force he assembled was sufficient for the task. The armies found each other at the Westwater Bridge. Sir Duncan the Tall killed Damon III. Duncan was Kingsguard now, wearing the white cloak that the silver-haired young man at White Walls had told him he would wear. The dream had been accurate. Damon II had told a hedge knight at a wedding tourney that he would wear a white cloak. That hedge knight had become the instrument of the Fourth Rebellion's ending. A secondary casualty at the Westwater Bridge sits in the accounts. Sir Jason Lannister's brother died in the fighting. His death made Titus Lannister the heir to Casterly Rock. Titus Lannister's son was Tywin. The man who would dominate the politics of Westeros may have walked a very different path if it wasn't for this Fourth Rebellion. Bittersteel escaped. Again, he returned to Essos, to the Golden Company, and to the grinding work of rebuilding what the Fourth Rebellion had cost. That reserve was lower now than it had ever been. The Fourth Rebellion had demonstrated something the first three, despite their failures, had not quite demonstrated. The passage of time was working against the cause more reliably than any loyalist army. Bittersteel understood this. He was old now, old and hard, and still certain that his cause, the Blackfyre cause, was just. He died in Essos, in a skirmish between Tyrosh and Myr in the disputed lands. Not a battle with stakes commensurate with the life being ended. He died without having put a Blackfyre on the Iron Throne. He had spent his entire adult life in the service of that purpose. From the moment he carried Daemon's sons across the narrow sea to the morning he died in a nameless skirmish, he had not deviated from it. His bones did not go home. The cause did not die with him. The sword was still there, and there was one more Blackfyre. The ending of the Blackfyre line arrived in the year 260 after Aegon's conquest. Maelys Blackfyre was not the black dragon his great-grandfather had been. 6 decades of exile and 4 failed rebellions had filtered Damon I's phenomenon down to its residue. He was large and strong and possessed the Valyrian features of his bloodline. He also had a second head. This was a smaller, undeveloped growth at his neck, the vestige of a twin that had not fully separated. Men called him Maelys the Monstrous. The name was given as description rather than insult, in the way that names derived from appearance are given when the appearance is sufficiently remarkable. He had won command of the Golden Company by killing his own cousin. But the Golden Company would not be enough alone to take Westeros. He gathered other exiles, warlords, and would-be rulers from across Essos, men who had lost power or never held it, but meant to. Together, they formed what became known as the Band of Nine. Each of them had a kingdom in mind. Some looked to the Stepstones, others to the disputed lands. Maelys wanted Westeros. This distinguished him from the other 8. He had no particular interest in kingdoms in the disputed lands. The Stepstones were a staging ground. He intended to cross from them to the same shore his great-grandfather had crossed to, carrying the same sword and the same claim. King Jaehaerys made a decision that departed from the pattern of his predecessors. He did not wait. He sent a fleet and an army to the Stepstones to engage the Band of Nine on ground that was neither Westerosi nor the defended territory of any free city. The Greyjoys sent 100 longships. The Westerlands sent 1,000 knights and 10,000 men-at-arms. The Dornish sent spears. The other great houses contributed in the proportions that the campaign required. The army was, in its composition, an illustration of what Daeron II had built with the Dornish marriages 60 years before. Ancient enemies fought alongside each other because a single crown had given them a single reason. The campaign lasted the better part of a year. Lord Ormond Baratheon commanded the Targaryen army and was among the first casualties. Command passed eventually to Gerald Hightower. The campaign produced its young men. Tywin Lannister, around 18 years old, commanded a portion of the Westerlands forces with a precision that observers noted. Steffon Baratheon was there, his father newly dead on the islands. Brynden Tully earned his early reputation in the press of the island fighting. Prince Aerys Targaryen was young and not yet what he would become. None of them knew yet what they were being made into. Wars are schools in the way that other schools are not. The men who came through the Stepstones would govern Westeros for the next generation. They learned their governance in the blood of the last Blackfyre War. Barristan Selmy was 19 years old. He had come to the Stepstones with the straightforward purpose of a young knight raised on a specific ideal of what knighthood meant. He cut through the Golden Company's ranks. The accounts of this are among the more vivid surviving records of the Stepstones campaign. He moved through the company's soldiers in the way that occasionally happens when a man's ability is simply of a different order than the men he is facing. He reached Melis. The last of the Blackfyre pretenders was not a small man or an easy opponent. He had spent his life in the hard school that the disputed lands provide. He met Selmy and found that the language had a native speaker who was better at it than he was. The duel was not long. The last of the Blackfyre line died on the shores of the Stepstones. Let the redgrass field cool. Let the Stepstones settle into the ordinary silence of islands that have seen fighting and recovered. Let the Golden Company's banners stop moving long enough to look at what they have been moving through. Look at what remains. What remains when the campaigns are finished and the claimants are counted and the sword is still somewhere east, is a question. The same question that was planted in the soil of the realm when a king placed a sword in his bastard son's hands. He died years later without reckoning with what that gesture had set in motion. What makes a king? The Blackfyre Rebellions spent 100 years refusing to let the realm answer that question on its own terms and move on. Every time the Loyalist victories tried to close it, the question opened again. Not always immediately, not always loudly, but it opened because the closing had never been clean enough and the wound beneath it had never been properly tended. The rebellions were not simply a military problem that the Targaryens managed with varying degrees of effectiveness across 5 attempts. They were a symptom. The disease was older and ran deeper. It had nothing to do with Damon Blackfyre specifically, and everything to do with the particular kind of rot that sets in when a dynasty stops deserving what it holds and has not yet lost it. Aegon the Unworthy is the figure that the history keeps returning to, and with reason. He is the origin point. He is the man who did the specific damage that produced the specific consequence. The directness of the chain from his deathbed decree to the redgrass field to the Stepstones. He never saw what he had started. He never paid for it. The men who paid were everyone else. 10,000 on the redgrass field. More in the campaigns before it. More in the 3 subsequent rebellions. The small folk who had no stake burned and starved regardless. They paid for Aegon the Unworthy's deathbed gesture across a century. He paid nothing. This is not unusual in the history of power. It is simply honest. Consider what Daeron II actually built. He is not the figure that the history finds most compelling. He does not have Daemon's magnetism, or Bittersteel's iron certainty, or Bloodraven's cold precision. He is the administrator in the story of warriors. But look at what he did. He brought dawn into the realm. Not through fire, but through marriage. Through the patient, unglamorous work of finding the terms that an ancient enemy could accept and offering them sincerely enough that the offer was believed. He held the realm through a civil war that split it nearly in half, without the dragons that had made the original conquest possible. He made mistakes. The punishment was calibrated badly in the direction of producing future conspirators, rather than preventing them. He moved too slowly against Damon before the rebellion began. He allowed Bittersteel to survive when survival meant decades of additional attempts. These were the mistakes of a careful man, rather than a reckless one. He was not a perfect king. He was a good one. The contrast between what he built and what his father had spent a reign dismantling is one of the cleaner illustrations in Westerosi history of what a single reign can do. It can move toward stability or away from it, toward the slow accumulation of trust or toward the systematic destruction of it, Bloodraven is the figure the history cannot decide about. He sits in the account as the man who made the Loyalist victories possible, and the man whose methods made those victories cost more than they were worth. Without him, the Second Rebellion becomes a genuine war. Without him, the Third Rebellion finds a realm less prepared. With him, the realm got a hand who executed men under promises of safe conduct. Every great lord felt watched in his own hall. An entire generation's resentment was accumulated in the service of preventing that resentment from becoming another army. He won the battles and spent the trust. His methods were those of a man who had decided that the realm's survival was more important than the realm's comfort. He was probably right in the narrow sense and wrong in the broader one. The vulnerability he created was slower acting than the Blackfyre threat. It was not less real. The accumulated damage of his tenure contributed to the specific quality of brittle compliance that the Targaryen dynasty developed in its later years. Lords who obeyed through fear rather than loyalty. Robert Baratheon's rebellion did not come from nowhere. It came from exactly this. A dynasty that had been spending its legitimacy faster than it was earning it. This is largely in thanks to the kind of governance that Bloodraven had modelled and the later, worse kings had practiced without his precision. He had been the best at a bad thing. Being the best at a bad thing is not enough. Bittersteel deserves an honest accounting. He was the most consequential figure in the entire history of the Black Dragon. More consequential than Damon I, whose death was supposed to end it. He built the institution that kept the cause alive and maintained the sword that kept the claim material. 4 attempts he organized, surviving 3 loyalist victories, dying in a nameless skirmish without having accomplished the thing his life was for. He had loved Damon I with the specific devotion of a man who found in another person the purpose his own life required. He had watched him die on a ridge with 7 arrows in him. He carried the children across the water, built the institution, and kept his faith in the Black Dragon. He kept it alone, at the end. His bones stayed east, unrecovered, unhonored by the realm he had spent his life trying to return to. He deserved better than the ending he received. He probably knew, in the last years, that the ending he deserved and the ending he would receive were not the same thing. He kept going anyway. That, finally, is what Bittersteel was. Whether that quality is admirable or simply the description of a stubbornness so complete it became indistinguishable from purpose, that is a judgment each listener must make for themselves. The Blackfyre Rebellions changed what ambition looked like in Westeros for a century. Before the Redgrass Field, the great lords competed laterally against each other across the old borders of the kingdoms that Aegon had bent into a single realm. After the Redgrass Field, a new form of ambition was visible. The ambition of the claimant, the ambition that said the crown itself was the prize. The Iron Throne was not simply the authority above all other authorities. It was the specific object that the right man could possess. Robert Baratheon's rebellion was not a Blackfyre rebellion. It did not fly a black dragon, but it was conducted in the same political grammar that the Blackfyre Rebellions had written. The grammar that said, "The throne is the prize. The man who holds it does not hold it by divine right, but by the will of the lords who have chosen to accept him. When enough lords choose to stop accepting him, the choice can be unmade and remade in a different direction." Robert's rebellion succeeded where the previous 5 had not because it was more legitimate. Legitimacy, as the Blackfyre story demonstrates, is what the victors say it is. It succeeded because the dynasty it opposed had finally accumulated enough damage that the Loyalist coalition simply did not form again. The lords who would have ridden for Aerys II in the way that their grandfathers had ridden for Daeron II were not there. The Blackfyre Rebellions did not cause Robert's rebellion, but they prepared the ground for it. The ground that had been soft when Daeron II stood on it was hard by the time Aerys II needed it to hold. Now, let's return to our question. What makes a king? Birth was the Loyalist answer. The right mother and the right documents, and the unbroken chain of lawful succession from the founder of the line. But Damon I had Targaryen blood from both parents. He looked more like the dynasty's founder than the dynasty's heir, and had been given the sword that the dynasty used to designate its kings. The birth argument was clean only if you did not look at it closely. Quality makes a king, the Blackfyre sympathizers said. The right man, regardless of the documents. The man who looked like a king and fought like a king. But Damon I died with 7 arrows in him. Quality was real, but it was not destiny. The better man did not always win. Victory makes a king, Bloodraven's governance suggested. The man who wins is the man who was right. But the winning at the Redgrass Field had required the breaking of something that did not grow back. None of these answers is complete. None of them is wrong. What makes a king depends on the moment, the man, and the forces around him. The Blackfyre Rebellions reshaped Westeros. They turned great houses against each other. They hardened loyalties that would not easily break. They forced the crown to watch its own blood more closely than any foreign enemy. The crown learned. It learned to move faster, to act earlier, to treat rival claims as threats before they could become armies. Men like Bloodraven did not rise by accident. They were the answer to a problem the realm could no longer afford to ignore. The great houses learned as well. They learned the cost of choosing the wrong side. Lands were lost, lines were broken, names disappeared from the record. The price of rebellion was no longer uncertain. And still, rebellions did not end. They never do, because the conditions that created the Blackfyre Rebellions did not disappear. They remain, as they always have. Inheritance, ambition, opportunity. Given time, they will produce new claimants, new wars, and new men willing to risk everything for a crown. The Blackfyres are gone. Rebellion, as Westeros would soon learn, was staying put.